Hi, Kevin Ledoux, the pragmatic Luther at Ledoux Guitars, not making guitars at all today, but doing some furniture related things. And I thought maybe as I was doing this, some beginning woodworkers or intermediate woodworkers might be interested in what I'm doing because I'm making this molding. And it's impossible. Well, I don't suppose it's impossible. If you wanted to spend all kinds of money, you might be able to get a custom made shaper cutter to make exactly the profile you want, but then you'd need a heavy shaper to drive it, and it would cost you hundreds of dollars, I suppose. But you don't need to. You can make complex moldings by stacking them, and it's not that hard to do. Now, to do this, you're going to need, I would highly suggest a shaper, but if you don't have one, a router table will be just fine. You could probably do this with a handheld router if you're careful, but if you have to do a lot of long lengths of it, uh, a router is going to become a little bit clumsy. And of course, you're going to need a table saw. A drum sander would be a nice addition, but it's not necessary at all. So I'm going to show you right after this portion some of the various steps that I perform to do this, and I will attempt to describe them while that's happening. And then I'm going to come back after you've seen some of those steps and go through the assembly process and describe some of the little things that I've found out that might be helpful to you when it comes to trying to assemble one of these compound moldings. Just before we go to the machine operations, I thought you might be interested in seeing how this thing was made up, or that is, what particular bits did I use. The molding is composed of these two components and this third component, and this is what's key. This is a spline. Uh, Now you could use any combination of router bits and cutters that you prefer. This was just my design for the look that I'm after and what I'm doing here. Um, I started by making this cove molding, and I did that with this large cove bit. This is an Amana bit. It was quite expensive, but I'm of the notion that when you're swinging heavier bits like this, you want them to be pretty good quality, even if you're not going to use them an awful lot. So I was willing to spend a few extra dollars and get a good one. But you see, this lines up about like so. This was the first thing I did. And I want to emphasize that I did not mold this piece of wood as a little stick as you see it here. It was on the edge of a much wider board, which you'll see later in the video. But that's important because unless you've got stock feeders and all kinds of stuff to hold these small sticks very still as they pass through the machine, you're never going to mold an edge with this. It's going to flop around. You're probably going to get hurt. So don't do that. So there was the cove, and then after the cove was ripped off, I did mold this. The bit was actually oriented this way. I molded this rabbet into it like so. Also, I do this on a shaper. Some of you who are familiar with me know that I really don't care for router tables at all. I don't even approve of them really, but you can do this with a router table. That's just my preference. Um, so the next thing after that was to make this piece, the top of that. And that was done with only a portion of this bit. I only used a portion of it, which means that I had to use the fence on my shaper. And that would mean that you'd use the fence on your router table. Or if you have a handheld router, you could do this with an edge guide. You're just not cutting in as deep as that bearing goes. Or you may orient your work so that you use all of the bit. All of those choices are yours. So there's the basic components, and then there's this spline. If you do not have a drum sander, this might be a little bit challenging to make just on a table saw, but you can do it. It might take you a couple of trial runs to get the spline just the right thickness, but you can do that. So now the video will go on to the various machine operations. In this segment, I'm milling the wider top piece of the molding. Notice I'm using a wide board to do this, and after I've milled the edge, I'll rip that off. In this section, I'm milling the cove molding. And as you can see again, I'm doing this on a wider piece of lumber, and then after that milling is done, I'll rip that off to get it to its correct width. This is very important to do this way because it's so much safer than trying to run a narrow piece, and especially when you're using a large cutter. After this, I'll mill the rabbet in the next segment, and then I'll rip that off on the table saw. Here I'm ripping the cove piece off the wider board. I have the cove faced up, and it does make it a little more difficult to get a push stick on it, but to have the cove down would be even more dangerous because it would cause the cove to roll into the blade. Here I'm ripping the spline grooves in each of the molded pieces. This is very easy to do, and as long as you don't move the rip fence before the job is complete, you know that each one of those cuts will be in the same relative position to one another, so they will line up perfectly. I'm still dry here before final assembly, but I wanted to draw these pieces out so that you can see each one and how they're related. The reason for the spline is to keep these two pieces together. And it's imperative when you make that spline cut. It's very simple. You're going to take your table saw and you're going to make a spline cut wherever you want it. And I suggest reasonably close to center if you can do that. And then on your secondary or tertiary piece, if it comes to that, you're going to want to make your spline in the same place. And that's easy. You're just going to rip this one, and then you're going to rip this one before you change the setup on your table saw, and they will by default be in the same place. But what I wanted to explain along with this is that when you glue this thing together, this can be a frustration. At least I've found that it can, and I've made up a lot of different moldings before, and this can be a problem. Excuse me, I got to reorient a little bit here. So when you assemble this, if you put clamping pressure on the front, that clamping pressure is really located there. And you may get, as you can see here, a gap. If you put pressure on the back edge, then you may get a small gap here in the front. So unless you want to make up some kind of a jig, a call, if you will, over this to clamp it down, it's going to be hard to glue that together. So you're going to have to find a way to do that. And you may want to make some calls to wrap over this, or even wrap it down with, I suppose you could wrap it down with cable if you had to. But I'm going to assemble this thing and show you what I came up with. All right, so I'm ready to glue up here. And I'm going to just put some glue in this groove for the spline first. And I'm gluing this area first because some of the glue is going to slop up out of it onto the surface. And I actually do want it there, but that's the reason I'm not pouring it on the surface. You can see it come up out of there already. And I'm running right down the back edge. And you can see I'm pulling away from the front of the molding because I don't want a lot of squeeze out there where that shows, because it's going to be just that much more difficult to clean that up when the time comes. And I'm brushing away from the front surface toward the back so that I'm not slopping the glue all over the place. And I have slopped that glue all over, and it's a pain to scrape it off the exposed surfaces after the fact. So it's really worth paying close attention to. Now, I want to mention a word about these splines. They don't want to fit real tight. If they fit real tight, when you put glue in there and squeeze all of this together, that wood is going to swell just a few thousandths of an inch possibly, and you're going to have nothing but a difficult time uh, trying to get that stuff together. It just makes assembly that much harder. And your spline is not so much for strength as it is for alignment. That's really all it's for. So we're not terribly concerned there. So don't make your spline fit too tight. If you have to force it in, you're probably not going to have a good assembly. It's just going to be too difficult to do. So I've put the spline in place on one of the parts, and I've put some glue on it because I do want the whole thing to be solidly put together. And so now I have my assembly. Okay, there it is. So now the question is, how am I going to keep it together? Well, what I came up with was this. Up here on this edge, I'm going to use one of these cam clamps, and then I'm going to alternate on the front with these single-handed clamps. These, by the way, these clamps are quite handy. These only have a 2-inch capacity, but I like them. I use them around here quite a bit. And they're nice because they're single-handed clamps. And by the way, these cam clamps, I guess I'm supposed to call them Luther's clamps, except the company that originally made them, the Clemsia brand, was around long before Luther's were using these, I believe. So they are cam clamps by my estimation. So I'm just running down through and gluing this, alternating. And I don't want or need a tremendous amount of pressure because, first of all, aliphatic resin glue only requires about 10 pounds per square inch. And I just want to hold, oops, see, I got a little bit of squeeze out right there. That I'm going to have to scrape that out later. Pain in the rear. So you don't need that much pressure. It's just not required. We're just trying to keep this stuff lined up. Okay? I think I'll relocate a little closer here. And one more cam clamp right here. And one more spring clamp here. And I think we've got it made. So now, it's quite an assembly, isn't it? Now, if you're going to do this in long lengths, which I have done this in 8 and 10 foot lengths, you need to make up some sort of a clamping scheme and get it well rehearsed and organized before you assemble all of this. But it's not too difficult to do, really. And as I said, if you have a router table or a shaper, you're golden. But even with a handheld router, you can make up compound moldings. And here is the actual application of this molding after it's made up. I suppose you could put this together with pneumatic brads or something if you have that luxury, or if your molding allows you to do it, you could do that. I wanted to stay without metal fasteners in this. I did have to compromise. Right there on the corner, you can see there's a little brad to help keep that miter in line. But beyond that, this went on without the use of metal fasteners. And what made it possible for me to assemble this without the use of metal fasteners or screws from behind was this spline. I went around the cabinet with an 1/8 inch router bit and cut that groove in it. And I cut a corresponding groove, as you can see here in this sample of molding. And by making up splines and putting that together, it all glues up very nicely. And I did make a clamping caul that surrounded this so that I could draw it in straight. So it's just that easy. Well, I hope you got something out of this video that you can use in your workshop, if not a few minutes of entertainment. I guess it's the retired shop teacher in me that makes me want to do these things. I just enjoy doing them. Just a quick reminder, I'm not subsidized by anybody, and I'm not paid to do any of this, and I won't, because I basically disapprove of that. So I hope you'll like the video here on YouTube, and I hope you might subscribe to my channel. I intend to do some more on general woodworking and basic woodworking techniques, so stay tuned. Thanks again for watching. I'm Kevin Ledoux at Ledoux Guitars, proving once again that I don't just make guitars, but I am the largest manufacturer of guitars in the entire town of Triangle, New York.